Amelia settled into her beloved armchair in the Daily Grind, the cozy bookstore cafe that was practically an extension of her own living room. For 5 years, this had been her haven, a place where the aroma of freshly brewed coffee mingled with the comforting scent of old books. It was more than just a business, it was a community. The baristas knew her usual, a double-shot latte with oat milk. The owner, Mrs. Higgins, always stopped by for a quick chat about their shared love of classic literature. It was a sanctuary, a place where Amelia felt truly seen and appreciated. This particular Tuesday started much like any other. Amelia, a freelance editor, had just wrapped up a particularly grueling project and needed a dose of caffeine and quiet contemplation. The Daily Grind, with its mismatched furniture, overflowing bookshelves, and the gentle hum of conversation, was the perfect antidote to deadline stress. Sunlight streamed through the large front windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. The rhythmic whir of the coffee grinder and the soft strumming of a guitar from the cafe's playlist created a soothing soundtrack. As she perused the pastry case, her mind still buzzing with editorial notes, she noticed a new face behind the counter. A man in his late 30s, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit, was observing the staff with an almost clinical detachment. He looked out of place amidst the cafe's bohemian charm. New hires weren't uncommon, but this man had an air of authority that didn't quite fit the casual atmosphere. When her usual barista, Sarah, approached to take her order, Amelia requested her latte and a blueberry muffin. Sarah, usually bubbly and effervescent, seemed a little flustered, her smile strained. As Sarah turned to prepare the drink, the man in the suit glided over to Amelia, his polished shoes clicking softly on the wooden floor. "Excuse me," he said, his voice smooth but undeniably cold. Amelia looked up, a question forming on her lips. "Yes? I'm going to have to ask you to leave." Amelia's brow furrowed in disbelief. "Pardon me?" she asked, thinking she must have misheard. The man's expression didn't soften. "You need to leave. Now." His voice was firm, devoid of warmth. He stood a little too close, his body language radiating an almost palpable tension. It was as if he expected her to erupt, to cause a scene. Amelia, however, was not one to be easily ruffled. Years of navigating demanding clients and tight deadlines had instilled in her a certain level of composure. She glanced around the cafe. Heads turned, conversations hushed. Patrons, mid-sip of their coffees, watched with undisguised curiosity. The air crackled with unspoken questions. A wave of confusion washed over Amelia, quickly followed by a surge of indignation. This was her haven, her happy place. How dare this stranger waltz in and demand she leave without a word of explanation? "Can you tell me why?" she asked, her voice calm and steady, though her heart was beginning to pound. The man paused, a flicker of something, perhaps hesitation, crossing his face. But then he masked it with a practiced indifference. "I don't need to explain myself." Amelia felt her blood boil. She had encountered her share of power-tripping individuals in her career, people who believed their position entitled them to treat others with disdain. She wasn't about to tolerate it, especially not here, not in her sanctuary. "Actually, I think you do," Amelia countered, her voice now laced with a quiet authority. "I've been coming here for years, and I've always been a respectful patron. If you're asking me to leave, I deserve an explanation, just like any other paying customer." A tense silence descended. The man's lips tightened into a thin line. He glanced towards Mrs. Higgins, who had emerged from the back office and was standing near the doorway to the kitchen, her expression unreadable. Mrs. Higgins, usually so warm and welcoming, remained frozen, offering no assistance. Why wasn't she intervening? Why was she letting this stranger treat a loyal customer with such blatant disrespect? Amelia's frustration mounted, but she kept it in check. Escalating the situation wouldn't solve anything. The man, seemingly at a loss for words, looked back at Amelia. Finally, he spoke, his voice dripping with condescension. "You're disturbing the other customers." The excuse was weak, almost laughable. Amelia raised an eyebrow. "Disturbing," she repeated, her gaze sweeping across the cafe. The other patrons were whispering amongst themselves, but no one seemed particularly agitated or distressed. They were more curious than anything else. "This is a public place," Amelia continued, keeping her tone neutral. "I'm simply waiting for my coffee. I haven't done anything to disturb anyone." But as she spoke, Amelia realized this wasn't simply a case of mistaken identity or a petty power play. There was something else at play, something more sinister. She had to know what it was. Why was she, a loyal and respectful customer, being singled out? What had changed? "I'll leave," Amelia said, her voice unwavering. "But only when I understand why you're asking me to go. That's only fair." Mrs. Higgins still hadn't moved, her eyes fixed on Amelia. The silence was deafening. Amelia refused to flinch. She wasn't going anywhere until she got the answers she deserved. This wasn't just about her, it was about principle. She wasn't going to let this man, whoever he was, trample on her rights. Have you ever felt that quiet, simmering anger when someone tries to push you around for no good reason? What would you have done in Amelia's shoes? Amelia stood her ground, the quiet murmur of the cafe providing an oddly surreal backdrop to the mounting tension. She had never shied away from a challenge, but this felt different. The man wasn't providing any logical explanation for his actions, and Mrs. Higgins's continued silence was deeply unsettling. It felt as if they were waiting for her to crack, to lose her composure and storm out in a fit of anger. But Amelia was too smart for that. She knew that giving them what they wanted would only validate their unwarranted behavior. The more she considered the situation, the more her frustration deepened. It wasn't about the latte, it was about the blatant disrespect, the feeling of being targeted for reasons unknown. She had been a loyal patron for years, supporting the daily grind through thick and thin. Now she was being treated like an unwanted guest, and she wouldn't stand for it. The man's posture remained rigid, as if he were bracing himself for a full-blown confrontation. His eyes darted nervously between Amelia and Mrs. Higgins, who remained rooted to her spot by the kitchen door. Amelia noticed a subtle shift in the atmosphere, a collective holding of breath, as if everyone in the cafe was anticipating an explosion. What was really going on here? Why was she being singled out? The lack of answers only fueled her determination to uncover the truth. "You haven't given me a reason," Amelia repeated, her voice clear and firm, cutting through the tense silence. The man's jaw clenched. He cast another pleading glance at Mrs. Higgins, who finally began to walk towards them, her face etched with a mixture of annoyance and resignation. "I'm sorry, Amelia," Mrs. Higgins said, her tone uncharacteristically formal. "We've had a complaint about you." Amelia recoiled as if she'd been slapped. A complaint? About her? She couldn't recall ever doing anything that would warrant a complaint. She was always polite, always mindful of others. A complaint? What kind of complaint? She asked, her voice laced with disbelief. Mrs. Higgins hesitated, her gaze flickering downwards. "I'm afraid I can't disclose that information." Amelia felt a surge of indignation. "You're telling me you're going to ask me to leave based on a complaint I don't even know about?" The man beside her remained silent, but his posture stiffened. The situation was clearly becoming uncomfortable for him as well, but Amelia didn't care about making him uncomfortable. She cared about getting to the bottom of this. "This isn't right," Amelia declared, her eyes narrowing. She wasn't just speaking to Mrs. Higgins and the man anymore. She was addressing everyone in the cafe. "I've been coming here for years. I've never caused any problems. If someone has an issue with me, I deserve to know what it is." Mrs. Higgins' eyes flickered with a hint of sympathy, but she quickly regained her composure. For a brief moment, it seemed as if she might back down, but then she cleared her throat and stuck to her prepared script. "I'm sorry, Amelia," she repeated, her voice losing its earlier edge and taking on a more apologetic tone. "I've been instructed to ask you to leave." Amelia took a deep breath, fighting to maintain her composure. She refused to let her emotions dictate her actions. She wasn't going to simply walk out without understanding why this was happening. She turned her gaze back to the man beside her, her voice low but firm. "I'm not leaving until I get an explanation. I've been a loyal customer here, and I won't be treated this way without knowing why." For a moment, it looked as if the man might argue, but he simply shook his head slightly, clearly uncomfortable with the escalating situation. Mrs. Higgins, too, seemed caught between wanting to resolve the situation quickly and realizing that Amelia wasn't going to back down. "Listen," Amelia said, softening her tone slightly. "I'm not trying to cause any trouble. I just want to understand what's going on. If there's a legitimate reason for me to leave, I'll go, but I deserve to know what it is." Mrs. Higgins looked at Amelia, then back at the man. After a moment of hesitation, she finally spoke. "I'm sorry, Amelia," she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's just protocol." Amelia raised an eyebrow. "Protocol," she echoed, the word hanging in the air. "What protocol? I've been coming here for years. This place has always been welcoming. What's changed?" The man and Mrs. Higgins exchanged an unreadable look. It was as if they were both waiting for something, perhaps for Amelia to break down, perhaps for her to simply give up and leave. But she wasn't about to do that, not now. The silence stretched on, and for a moment, Amelia thought she might be getting nowhere. But then, something shifted. As the tension continued to escalate, Amelia could sense that this situation wasn't going to end quietly. The silence in the room was almost unbearable. She felt the weight of every single person's gaze upon her. Amelia could sense that both the manager and the man beside her were growing increasingly uneasy by the second, but she remained steadfast in her pursuit of the truth. "I'm still waiting for an explanation," Amelia said, her voice even and firm. "I'm not going to let this situation slide just because it's awkward or uncomfortable. Why am I being asked to leave? What complaint could possibly justify this?" Mrs. Higgins shifted uncomfortably, as if trying to decide whether to continue with this bizarre charade or finally reveal the truth. Amelia could see the struggle in her eyes. For a brief moment, Mrs. Higgins' face softened, but she quickly masked it with an impersonal expression. "I don't have all the details," Mrs. Higgins said, her voice growing quieter. "I was just told to handle it. But I assure you, we don't normally ask people to leave for no reason." Amelia took a deep breath. Mrs. Higgins' words felt hollow, and Amelia sensed that she was struggling with the situation. She had to know something wasn't right, and yet she was still clinging to the directive she'd been given. "Can you at least tell me who made this decision?" Amelia pressed, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Who gave the order?" Mrs. Higgins hesitated, her eyes flicking towards the man standing by her side. "It came from Mr. Harding," she finally muttered, as if it pained her to admit it. "But like I said, I don't know the full reason." Amelia's heart skipped a beat. Mr. Harding. That was a name she hadn't heard in a long time. Mr. Harding was the silent business partner, rarely seen but always looming in the background. His focus was always on the bottom line, and Amelia had always suspected he didn't quite appreciate the community-focused atmosphere of the daily grind. "Mr. Harding? The business partner?" Amelia asked, her voice tinged with disbelief. "That doesn't make sense. I've been coming here for years. Why would he suddenly ask me to leave without any explanation?" Mrs. Higgins glanced back at the man, clearly uncomfortable with the line of questioning. Amelia didn't let up. She could feel the pieces of the puzzle starting to shift in her mind, and something wasn't adding up. This wasn't just a random complaint or some routine misunderstanding. There was something more at play here, something deeper. The man standing beside her, who had been eerily silent up until this point, finally spoke up. "It's not what you think," he said, his voice low and slightly apologetic, though his words were still firm. "It was just a misunderstanding." Amelia tilted her head, her gaze piercing. "A misunderstanding? Then why didn't anyone clarify it before things got this far?" She gestured around the cafe. "I've been sitting here for over an hour, and no one said anything to me." The man shifted his weight, his eyes darting between her and Mrs. Higgins. It was clear now that he was deeply uncomfortable, but Amelia wasn't about to let that stop her from getting to the truth. Something was fishy, and she was determined to figure it out. "Look," she said, her voice steady and sharp, "I've been loyal to this place. I've always treated people with respect, and I expect the same in return. If there's a misunderstanding, fine. But I deserve an explanation, not to be treated like this." Another long pause hung in the air. The tension was suffocating. The man seemed to be trying to muster some kind of response, but he was unsure how to proceed. He looked back at Mrs. Higgins again, who had yet to make eye contact with Amelia. But it wasn't until Mrs. Higgins spoke again that the first cracks in the mystery began to appear. Mrs. Higgins finally exhaled deeply, as if she had been holding her breath for far too long. Amelia could see the weight of the situation pressing down on her. But it wasn't just the pressure of the moment. It was guilt. She knew that something wasn't right, and she was finally starting to break under the strain. "I'm really sorry for how this has gone," Mrs. Higgins said, her voice wavering. "But Mr. Harding, he had some concerns about you. Have you ever had someone make assumptions about you based on incomplete information or personal biases? How did it make you feel?" Amelia's heart skipped a beat. Concerns about her? She hadn't done anything wrong, and she had no idea what Mrs. Higgins was talking about. Concerns? What kind of concerns? Amelia asked, her tone firm yet controlled. "You're telling me I've been coming here for years, and suddenly Mr. Harding has concerns about me. What happened? I need to know." Mrs. Higgins hesitated, her eyes darting to the man standing beside Amelia. The man seemed increasingly uncomfortable, but remained silent. Amelia could see that he was still trying to figure out how to navigate this delicate situation, but Amelia wasn't going to let him off that easily, not anymore. "I'm just the manager. I don't know all the details," Mrs. Higgins muttered, shifting from one foot to the other. "But I think it's something to do with the way you've been, well, with the way you've been engaging with other customers lately." Amelia raised an eyebrow, her expression incredulous. "Engaging with other customers?" she repeated, her voice edged with disbelief. "What exactly are you implying?" The man beside her suddenly stepped in, his voice low but urgent. "Look, it's not about you, okay? It's just, there was a misunderstanding about some of your interactions with other guests." He swallowed hard before continuing, as if he was carefully choosing his words. "Mr. Harding thought you were, making others uncomfortable." Amelia blinked, completely taken aback. This was the first she'd heard of anything like this, and it made absolutely no sense. She had always been friendly, polite, and respectful to the other patrons. Sure, she was outgoing and social, but never in a way that would make anyone feel uncomfortable. This whole situation felt like a twisted game, and Amelia wasn't going to let them play her. "Making people uncomfortable," Amelia repeated, her voice rising slightly with confusion and frustration. "How? In what way? I've been here for years, and I've never had a complaint about my behavior. If someone felt uncomfortable, they should have said something. But I've never, not once, been told that I was doing anything wrong." Mrs. Higgins glanced nervously at the man again, but this time the man remained silent. Amelia could see that the walls around them were starting to crumble. She wasn't just questioning the situation anymore, she was calling them out for their inconsistency. Mrs. Higgins looked down, avoiding Amelia's gaze. "Look," she said, her voice quieter now. "I don't want to be in the middle of this. I'm just doing my job. But if you want to talk to Mr. Harding, maybe you should just give him a call." Amelia felt a surge of triumph, but she kept it contained. She wasn't going to settle for an apology and a simple phone call. No, this wasn't just about clearing her name. It was about making sure this kind of treatment didn't happen again. "Fine," she said, her tone sharp and decisive. "I'll call Mr. Harding. But before I leave, I need to hear the truth. No more vague excuses, no more dodging the question." Mrs. Higgins opened her mouth to respond, but then closed it again, her words trapped somewhere between regret and frustration. Amelia could tell that she was finally seeing how much she'd messed up. As the silence stretched on, Amelia stood tall, her confidence unwavering. She had taken control of the situation. It wasn't just about defending herself, it was about making sure that her voice was heard. Amelia took a deep breath, lightly tapping the edge of the table. She felt the weight of the moment, but wasn't going to let it overcome her. She has fought for the truth, and now it was time to hold the responsible ones for it. The manager had already begun to remorse, but it wasn't enough. Amelia wasn't there for half-hearted apologies. She wanted to hear from Mrs. Higgins herself. "Give me a moment," Amelia said to the manager with a steady voice. She wasn't asking for permission, but was giving them space to react. She pulled out her phone and dialed Mr. Harding's number, with her fingers moving with precision. The phone rang twice before he answered with a warm and familiar voice. "Amelia, it's been a while. How are you?" Amelia composed herself before responding. "I'm fine, Mr. Harding, but I need to talk about something urgent. I am here at the Oak Room. I've just been asked to leave by your manager with no explanation whatsoever, and to make things even worse, I was told that I somehow made the other customers uncomfortable. I need to know what's happening." There was silence on the other line. Amelia could hear him processing the situation on his mind as she spoke. Mr. Harding was proud of his employees to make sure his restaurant a place where respect exists. This was not the scenario that would escalate this far if something was not right. "Amelia, I'm so sorry," Mr. Harding said after a pause. "I trust my staff, but if there's any misunderstanding, we need to sort it out. What happened?" Amelia's frustration melted from Mr. Harding's tone, but she stayed focused. "I've been a loyal customer here for years. I have never had any issue with anyone. If someone had a problem with me, they should have said something. I am being told that there was a complaint about my behavior, but no one has told me what I supposedly did. I was trying to enjoy my lunch, and now I am being asked to leave." Mr. Harding had an exasperated sigh. "I am so sorry for this. I've known you for years, Amelia. You've always been respectful and polite. If there's any confusion, it should have been handled differently. I'll have a word with the manager. This isn't how we run things." Amelia could feel her heart slow down while the weight of the conversation began to settle. She wasn't getting an apology, but was getting the accountability for it as well. He was not making excuses, but brushing the situation. "I appreciate that, Mr. Harding," Amelia replied with a soft voice. "But this isn't about me. It's about making sure this doesn't happen with others. I don't want to cause trouble, but can't let this slide." "I understand, Amelia. I'll fix this right away. You deserve respect, and I'll make sure the staff knows about it moving forward. I want you to feel comfortable when you come here," he replied. The conversation ended with Mr. Harding promising to handle the situation and hung up. Amelia returned the attention to the manager standing awkwardly avoiding her. The man beside had disappeared into the background trying to avoid it. The manager cleared his throat. "I've spoken with Mr. Harding. He's upset with what happened and promises to make things right." Amelia nodded, satisfied, but not quite ready to let the manager go. "I appreciate the talk with him, but this could have been avoided if there was a communication. I was a customer trying to have a meal and shouldn't have been treated like this." The manager looked down his face, reddening. "You're right. I should have handled it differently. I'm really sorry on how it was down." Amelia's expression was showing apology accepted. But remember, it's not just about making apologies. It's about treating people with respect at the start. No one should feel like this. The manager was nodding. "I'll make sure this doesn't happen again." Amelia gave him a small smile. "I am glad to hear. Just make sure that if something like this happens is communication. That is key." While she was turning to leave, she could see other customers' eyes on her. But this time, it was different. This time she had taken control and had shown that there was power in calm communication, even in frustration and chaos. But when Amelia walked from Oak Room, she knew it wasn't about her, but the reminder that respect and clarity. It was not privileges, but rights, and sometimes it takes for a person to bring the change. Stepping out from Oak Room and into the afternoon, she breathed deeply and let fresh air fill her. The conflict was over, but lingered on her. It was not just about the unpleasant conversation, but the awkwardness to be asked to leave. It was about her principle. She had walked to the restaurant to have a meal, but thrust into the situation that tested her patience, to standing for herself and the belief on fairness. Now that it was over, Amelia felt quiet with satisfaction. She had not backed down. She hadn't let her emotions control her. She was calm and handled the situation with grace in the end, getting the apology that she deserved. More importantly, she made sure the problem was addressed, making sure no one will go through it. While walking down the street, heading back to her car, she shifted her thoughts to the event that had just unfolded to what had learned from it. She knew that wasn't a story to have been asked to leave a restaurant, but a power in self-respect, the importance in communication, and how standing for what's right can lead the change. She thought about easily walking out of the restaurant on frustration, avoiding confrontation. She could simply avoid the explanation and leave without any word and chalk it as an experience. But instead, she asked questions, demanded answers, and insisted the respect it was due. By doing so, she not only resolved the conflict, but ensured that the manager and owner knew her. Amelia was proud to handle and use her voice to make a difference. It wasn't just about the restaurant or a meal, it was a stand for fairness, dignity, and respect in every aspect. While getting into her car, Amelia smiled, realizing the lesson she learnt that day. She had reminded her and people around that standing for yourself never requires confrontation or chaos. Sometimes the most powerful thing to do it is simply remain and stand your ground by always demanding the respect it is deserved. It was her learning, as she would carry to wherever life takes her. The ending of this story is not about the restaurant and the meal, it's about taking a stand for fairness, dignity, and respect in every aspect in life. As she got into her car, she smiled to herself, thinking about the lesson learned. This story taught her to remember, and people around her, that standing up for yourself does not require shouting or chaos. Sometimes being calm, confident will be enough by knowing you. Did you like it? Don't forget to comment and subscribe for more exciting and interesting stories. Wish you a good health, peace, and success.